Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're in session number 4 of our new series entitled The QME Report, the Compliance, the Credibility, and the Persuasiveness Checksheet. And today we're in session 4, and before we get into today's topics, let's just review where we've come from so far in this program. And just to refresh our own memories and to remind ourselves that the purpose of this program is to help improve the content and quality of your final finished product, which bears your signature and which represents you out in QME, the QME marketplace, and out in QME Cyberland, and that is your final QME report. And we're focusing on producing high quality reports that, number one, resolve disputed issues in the workers' compensation system. Number two, that can actually be used by the parties. In other words, they qualify as substantial medical evidence, and therefore they represent a product that can be used out there in the system to expeditiously move cases forward in the system. That's number two. And then number three, high quality reports that reduce delays and log jams in the system and that simultaneously reduce costs, unnecessary time wasting costs that are an unintended consequence of reports that are low quality reports. And so here we're focusing on improving our QME reports. And let's just remind ourselves, what is actually a high quality report? What are the characteristics? What are the features of what is being referred to out in the industry as a high quality report? Well, number one, high quality reports comply with all the labor codes, all the codes of regulations, California codes of regulation, all of the laws and all of the case laws that govern the QME process and also the production of the QME report. And there's many laws that govern the work that we do, and we spent sessions 1 and 2 talking about most of the most relevant laws and codes that govern the QME report. Number two, and this is critical, is that high quality reports have to be capable of proving or disproving a disputed fact. Can you imagine the chagrin of the parties when, after great wait, they finally open up the envelope that contains your qualified medical evaluation report, and they read the report, and lo and behold, the report fails to resolve the issue for which they hired you to resolve the issue, and on top of that, to add salt to the wounds, they get your billing for which you expect to be paid for this report that serves the parties no purpose whatsoever. What would you do if that happened to you out in the marketplace? Imagine if you had a similar frustration out in the marketplace. Say, for example, you paid a vendor to produce some repairs on your automobile, and after collecting your fee, you realized that the repairs were in no way done at all. What would you do? This is the dilemma that's facing the parties, and especially the payers of our reports. They don't so much as mind paying for our reports as they mind paying for reports that don't resolve the issue at all. And it's this feature, this component of QME reports, that they fail to resolve disputed issues, that creates the log jams in the system and unnecessary escalating and skyrocketing costs for medical legal evaluations. Now, in order for your report to be able to prove or disprove a disputed fact, your opinions and conclusions contained within your report must qualify as substantial medical evidence. So high quality reports contain opinions and conclusions that qualify as substantial medical evidence. Now, I've spoken many times in many programs about substantial medical evidence. What substantial medical evidence is a new language that qualified medical evaluators, all of whom are doctors, this is a new language that we as doctors need to learn. This is a new legal way of fashioning your opinions and conclusions in such a way that legally those opinions and conclusions, those medical opinions and conclusions, can be used legally. How about that? How about that? I believe that's an accurate description of what substantial medical evidence is. And let me repeat that. Substantial medical evidence, in providing our opinions and conclusions and qualifying them as substantial medical evidence, when we do that, we take medical opinions and conclusions produced by us as doctors, and we present them in language in such a way that those medical opinions from doctors can be used legally in the system by judges and attorneys who are legal specialists. They can convert our medical opinions into legal decisions in the workers' compensation system. So it's a new language, and I found that many doctors are not fluent in this language of substantial medical evidence, and I have to admit to you that it's not easy to do. It's not easy to qualify your opinions as substantial medical evidence, and not everyone can do it. Not every doctor has the desire, number one, and number two, has the skill or talent of converting what they know medically into language that can be used legally. Not every doctor can do this, much as not everyone can drive a golf ball 300 yards, and not everyone can dunk a basketball, right? Tiger Woods could talk to you all day long about how to drive a golf ball 300 yards, and he could tell you every secret and every sequence of what he does in order to drive the golf ball 300 yards, but that doesn't mean that I, with my skill and talent as a golfer, am going to be able to drive the golf ball 300 yards, and so it is also with substantial medical evidence. Not everyone can do this, not everyone has the desire to do this, and it's very, very difficult. But it's going to be incumbent upon you as a qualified medical evaluator in the future that you learn this language, and if you have the desire to do it, it will come to you quite naturally if you just put some time and attention into your reports in qualifying those opinions as substantial opinions. And I'll give you an exact formula in our next session as to how to do that. And then finally, high quality reports contain all of the required elements that are described in CCR 10606 and also that are described in more detail in the 2016 Physician's Guide. So CCR 106 provides an abbreviated description of the required elements. If you want a more elaborated description, you would go to the 2016 Physician's Guide. And these two sources tell us what sections in our report make our report specific to the California workers' compensation system. And it's these specific sections, which are topic headings in our report, that separate and make distinct our reports or distinguish our reports from other reports that we might provide in our medical / chiropractic / podiatric / dental / psychology practice, including reports that we might use to generate a personal injury report for a personal injury case or other medical report that we might generate in our clinical practice. It's these specific required elements that make our reports specific to the California workers' compensation system and that make our reports that can be used by the parties in the California workers' compensation system. So if you're using a report template from your clinical practice or something that you might use in generating personal injury reports, I suggest that you modify that template to include the required elements that are contained in these two reference sources. In other words, it's not a bad idea to continue using that template, but that template needs to be modified so that it's specific to the California workers' compensation system. If you don't modify the existing template that you're using and it's not specific to the California workers' compensation system, it's like apples and oranges, or trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, and these reports do not qualify as high quality reports because they're not specific to the California workers' compensation system. So it's all about producing high quality reports, and high quality reports, number one, are reports that show and demonstrate your compliance with these guidelines, with these rules, with these regulations, and with these case laws. Now in today's session, what I want to do is I want to expand upon the required elements that we talked about in our last session and show you how in the body of your report, in discussing each of the sections that are required by these two reference sources, in discussing each of these topic headings in your report, how to install credibility into each of these sections, credibility in you as a qualified medical evaluator, and how to install persuasive punch into the text in each of these sections in your report. And so when it comes to credibility and persuasiveness in your report, much of the perceived credibility of you as a qualified medical evaluator and much of your persuasiveness in providing your opinions and conclusions has to do with your perceived attention to detail. Your attention to detail, or your lack of attention to detail. So let me give you an example. If you're reading a report and it's a 20-page report, let's say, for example, and there's one single typo on page 11 of the report, one single error, is that going to damage your credibility or the persuasive power of your QME report? Probably not. Probably not. One single typo, anyone can be forgiven for one single typo. But let's say, for example, on page 1 of your report, you have one single typo and one single instance where you use the pronoun he when in fact you're actually referring to a female examinee, and it should say she, but in your report it says he. So there's a typo and there's a misuse of a pronoun. Is that gonna affect the credibility and persuasive power of the report? Who knows, really, but it catches the eye of the reader, and these two errors register in the mind of the reader. Now let's consider on the same page, page 1, where there's a typo, there's a misuse of a pronoun, and then also in the middle of the page, you as the qualified medical evaluator use two different font sizes. So the typical font for your text is font 11, but where you insert the examinee's name, Mrs. Jones, the reader of the report notices that, wow, this is a different font. This is font 12. And so you have a mixture of fonts. And let's say those font sizes are different font styles, where the text in your report is Times New Roman, but the examinee's name is in Calibri, okay, is in Calibri font with a larger text size. And as each of these errors, singular errors, start to accumulate, it starts to damage the credibility and the persuasiveness of you as a qualified medical evaluator, and finally, ultimately, of your opinions and conclusions in your report. Now, conversely, on the other hand, when you, in the body of your report, in each of these sections, headings in your report, when you demonstrate to the reader of the report your fastidious and meticulous attention to detail, as those attention to detail examples or exemplars register in the mind of the reader and they start to accumulate, and the reader of the report notices meticulous attention to detail once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, multiple times, those also accumulate in the mind of the reader, and start to create a picture of you as a fastidious, credible, and persuasive and correct qualified medical evaluator, whereas multiple errors and omissions do the exact opposite. So in today's discussion, let's talk about how to install credibility and persuasiveness into each of these sections of your report. So with that as our introduction, let's begin today's discussion, which is session number 4 of our new series entitled the QME Report, the Persuasiveness, Credibility, and Compliance Check Sheet. Okay, so let's talk about the identifying information section of our report. This is the very first opening section on page 1 of the report. Now, what I recommend is that you use a Microsoft Word table format and input all of this information into a table format. Now, I highly recommend table formatting for your QME report because it serves as a way to present information in a way that's clear and separate and distinct from text information on the page. So it helps this information to stand out as separate and distinct and all related information. So use a Microsoft Word table format or other word processing type of table. And I'll show you how this looks in your report. And I find many doctors do not use a table format. And I think it would help their reports to be clearer and to demonstrate to the parties their attention to detail to use a table format. And I'm sure you'll agree when you see the template that I want to share with you. So in the table, you would include the name of the examinee, their date of birth, and let me give you a couple of reasons why it's important to put the date of birth on the report. And there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps to identify the examinee, and it's one more source of identifying information that correlates the named examinee with the actual person involved with the industrial injury. And then there's another reason for those of you who frequently refer your examinees out to imaging facilities for diagnostic studies. Most imaging facilities file cases and images by date of birth rather than by name. Of course, they also file by name, but they prefer the date of birth. That's their primary search. Other scheduling facilities, such as One Call Medical, who are a large provider of diagnostic services here in the state of California, they also use the date of birth as their primary search criteria. So always put the date of birth on the identifying information of the report. Put the claim number, state the name of the employer, add in the examinee's social security number, put down also the date of injury. Include the examinee's driver's license number, and this is something that many doctors have not considered doing, but I recommend it. And you'll recall from earlier in this program, I described a procedure wherein you as the doctor exchange driver's licenses with the examinee. This helps to establish the tone of officiality at the beginning of the face-to-face evaluation. So you've already obtained the examinee's driver's license, and it's at this point in time that you simply type the driver's license number into your identifying information table on page 1 of your QME report. And there's a couple of good reasons for asking for the driver's license. Number one, it helps you to confirm their identity, to make sure that indeed that they are the person who you expect them to be, and that the examinee in front of you is actually the person that you're supposed to be evaluating. Number two, it allows you to confirm their height and weight, and allows you to inquire as to any discrepancies between the height and weight as it appears on the driver's license and the height and weight as the examinee appears before you on the day of the evaluation. And if you note any significant discrepancies, you should inquire as to the source of those discrepancies. Most commonly, discrepancy will involve changes in weight. Typically, examinees gain weight over time, although there are exceptions to this. It also allows you to get some other information that may or may not be useful to you in the process of your evaluation. For example, sometimes we have applicants who drive themselves to the evaluation, and yet they're unable to produce a driver's license. In other words, they're an unlicensed driver. This gives you some information. I don't know exactly what you can do with it, but I'll allow you to come up with your own uses for that type of information. For example, you might have an elderly person who gave up their driver's license due to being unable to pass perhaps the driving examination. In that case, the examinee would be unable to produce a valid driver's license, and this gives you information perhaps related to their relevant medical history, which could impact your opinions and conclusions related to the industrial injury. And there's probably other types of information that you can gather from this driver's license procedure, but here I list just a couple. In addition to all of that, you want to obtain a photo, a face shot of your examinee, and you want to include this on page 1 of your QME report. And this is to identify the examinee along with the date of the evaluation. In other words, you put the date of the evaluation right immediately below the face shot of the examinee. And this identifies the examinee to the parties. And I believe that this is an important procedure, and this procedure will help distinguish your reports from those reports that do not include a photograph of the examinee. And this concept comes under the heading of medical photography. And medical photography is beyond the scope of today's program, but let me just say that in the qualified medical evaluation, there are many instances and many circumstances where a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let me say that again. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and especially if that picture helps support one of your important opinions or conclusions. And let me just give you an example. Let's say you're providing for permanent impairment related to a post-surgical scar. Well, imagine the impact that a clear photo or a series of clear photos depicting this large hypertrophic and keloided scar would have in support of your conclusion for permanent impairment due to a scar. And that's just one example. So the point is, there are many uses and many applications of medical photography. And your medical photography begins with a simple face shot of your examinee on the date of the evaluation on page 1 of your report. And I believe that this is a valuable procedure, and I've been doing this procedure myself for now almost 2 decades. And I've never had any negative input from it, and I've only had positive input from it. I think it's valuable because it allows the parties to place a face with a name. Many times our examinees are simply known as a name, or they're simply known as a claim number, when in actuality they're actually people. And most of them are actually nice people. They're swell people, they're fine people, they're nice people, they're sincere people. And I believe it's important that the parties be able to place a face with a name. In fact, wouldn't it be nice if we as evaluators were able to see a picture of the examinee in advance of our evaluation? It might facilitate our attitude of liberal construction prior to even arriving at the evaluation procedure. So I think it's important, although this is not written anywhere in the AMA guides, I think it's important for the parties to realize that the examinee is a true, live, sincere person, that they have a face, and it's us as the qualified medical evaluators that sometimes gives them their first reminder of this. And we do that reminder by providing them with a photo on page 1 of the report. Number 2 is that taking a photo of the examinee is helpful to us as qualified medical evaluators because it allows you to identify the person if you have to revisit the case at some point later on in time. Let me give you an example of how this could play out. Imagine that you've done a report on Mrs. Jones, and as far as you know, you're done with Mrs. Jones. In other words, you've completed your report, you've provided your opinions and conclusions. As far as you're concerned, that's the last of it. Well, imagine you get a call 2 years later with the claims administrator saying that they need a reevaluation for Mrs. Jones. And you say, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones. I remember the name of Mrs. Jones. Let me see. And you go to your computer and you look up the report of Mrs. Jones, and right there on page 1 of your report is a photo of Mrs. Jones, and immediately you remember Mrs. Jones. And you say, oh, Mrs. Jones, I remember her. Okay, so what's up? We need a reevaluation. And it allows you to identify the person at points later in time if you have to revisit the case, which happens all the time. As you know, it happens all the time. So there are many good reasons for taking a photo of the examinee. Okay, and so what we have here is I've taken a screenshot of the QME report template. And I show here the identifying information exactly as I just described it. So here's a photo of the examinee, and this is just simply a photo of me that I cut and pasted in here. Underneath the photo of the examinee, you put the date that the photo was taken, and then in Microsoft Word table format, you include all of the identifying information in a tabular table format. So you see here that we're here today regarding Tom Smith. Here's the date of birth, claim number, such and such, date of injury, employer, social security number, and California driver's license number. Now, as you look at this identifying information here on this template, what kind of a sense do you get about the quality and the clarity of the report? You can tell that this is a report that's much different than many of the other reports that the claims examiner gets by the hundreds and hundreds. There's extra attention to detail in the form of using a Microsoft Word table. There's extra attention to detail in using a picture of the examinee. So the claims administrator or the attorneys involved can tell right off the bat that this report is special, that this report is clear, that this report is going to be good, that this report is different. And that's how you want to distinguish your reports from the masses that the parties receive on a daily basis. Okay, now the next section in the report is what's going to be referred to as our opening statement and or our introduction. Now, in the opening statement and introduction, we want to handle a couple of the high notes that are required. So, for example, we want to include the date that the appointment call was received. We want to include the date that the appointment was scheduled. The purpose of doing that is to demonstrate to the parties that we complied with timelines related to scheduling the appointment. We want to describe the address of the location of the examination. We want to provide the name and certification number and phone number of any interpreter that may have been present. We want to indicate that we complied with the requirements of Labor Code 4062.3 and CCR 40 A through C with regards to our disclosure requirements. And earlier on in today's program, we went over in great detail the disclosure requirements. So it's at this point in your report where you indicate to the parties that indeed you went through the disclosure requirements with the examinee. And I'll show you how that looks in the report in just a moment. Finally, you want to include the complexity factors that are involved with the billing level of your report. And billing for medical legal reports is described in California Code of Regulations 97/95, which require certain things of us if we are going to bill our reports at the complex levels and above. We have the ML 103 complex and we have the ML 104 complex comprehensive, both of which require specific descriptions and specific explanations from us. And I'll show you how we elaborate on those complexity factors here in our opening statement. We then go into the history section of the report after the introductory remarks. And this is where you elaborate on the facts, which are going to be the pertinent facts that will support your conclusions when you get to important conclusions, perhaps related to permanent impairment or perhaps related to the causation and apportionment of the permanent impairment. And so this is where you start to first mention the important facts upon which your opinions and conclusions rely and are going to be based. And you'll refer to these important facts in many sections later on in your report as you weave internal consistency throughout your report. Now, as we said earlier, the history and the relevant medical history sections of your report are done in two sections. And I described earlier in this program important reasons as to why these sections need to be done in two separate and distinct sections. You need to do the history and the relevant medical history, number one, as it's described in the medical records, and then number two, as it's described by the examinee. And this gives you two perspectives, and it allows you to shore up any inconsistencies that you may find either in the medical records or either in the testimony of the examinee. And I elaborated on that at great length earlier in the program, but let's just review how that would look in the context of your QME report. Okay, and now let's finish up now with a discussion about the review of records. And you'll recall that the 2001 Physician's Guide referred to this as sources of information. Sources of information. Well, it's interesting that they would use that term and not go into any great detail as to what's actually required of us in this section of our report. Now, they make a couple of mentions in the 2001 Physician's Guide that we must list our sources, where the information came from, any people that we interviewed or consulted with. Well, in actuality, the requirements of our review of records section are quite clearly laid out both in labor codes and in California codes of regulation. And there's several codes that govern the process involved with review of records. And I want to review this with you here. And then I'll show you how you can format your review of records section in your QME report so that it complies with the related labor codes and regulations. So let's begin with Labor Code Regulation 4062.3D. It says, in any formal medical evaluation, the agreed or qualified medical evaluator shall identify, now this is a key phrase, shall identify, and I'll show you how we identify the information. So the things that we're required to identify include, number one, all information received from the parties, all information reviewed in preparation of the report, all information relied upon in the formulation of his or her opinion. And isn't this interesting that Labor Code 4062.3 hints and alludes to some of the criteria that helps qualify our opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence. So later on, when we provide opinions and conclusions, we refer back to the information that we relied upon by citing it and identifying it here under our review of records section of our report. Okay, a couple of more codes and regulations. Labor Code 4628.82 requires that the physician review and summarize the prior medical records. So the prior code, 4062.3, required that we identify all information. Well, this code requires that we review and summarize. So what's the difference between identify and review and summarize? Well, I'll talk to you about that a little bit more and show you how to comply with both of those requirements when we get to our template. California Code of Regulation 10606 talks about the physician's report as evidence. It says that these reports, meaning our qualified medical evaluation reports, our reevaluation reports, our supplemental reports, any report that relies on information or any report wherein we received additional information, shall include, where applicable, a listing of all information received from the parties, reviewed in preparation of the report, or relied upon for the formulation of the physician's opinion. And isn't that amazing? It refers to substantial medical evidence, and it requires us here to list it. So far our requirements and obligations involve that we identify all information, that we review and summarize the prior medical records, and that we list all information received and reviewed and relied upon. Interesting. Finally, CCR 41B2 says that all QMEs, regardless of whether the injured worker is represented by an attorney or not, shall review all available relevant medical and non-medical records and/or facts necessary for an accurate and objective assessment of the contested medical issues in an injured worker's case before generating a written report. So when must the medical records be reviewed? When should they be reviewed? Do they have to be reviewed before the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee? No, it doesn't say that. It says, however, that the medical records need to be reviewed before generating a written report. So sometimes doctors will say that they're not able to see the injured worker in the face-to-face evaluation because they have yet to receive the medical records, but there's no provision in the code for that. The only provision is that the medical records be reviewed before the report is generated. And the report must list and summarize. List and summarize. So here we have review and summarize. Here we must list and summarize all medical and non-medical records reviewed as part of the evaluation. So let's review those obligations. 4062.3 says that we must identify all information. 4628 says that we must review and summarize. 10606 says that we must list, and then CCR 41 says we must list and summarize. So we have identify, review, list, and summarize. Identify, review, list, and summarize. Now, of those processes, which of those processes are passive processes and which of those processes are active processes? When it says that we review the records, what does that mean? Does that mean that we read the records? Does that mean that we go through the records and highlight the important components? What does that mean? What does it mean to summarize? What does it mean to list? What does it mean to identify? Well, let's talk about that by going now to our template. Okay, so here we are back at our template, and we're at the review of records section of our report. And I want you to begin this section of your report by indicating to the parties that you're aware of the regulations that govern the review of records section of the report. And I have those regulations listed for you right here. So you demonstrate to your parties your compliance with the regulations by showing them the regulations and then complying with these requirements. So here's Labor Code 4062.3 requires that we identify all information. 4628 requires that we review and summarize the medical records. 10606 says we should list it. And 41B2 says that we must list and summarize all medical and non-medical records reviewed as part of the evaluation. So you indicate that in compliance with all these codes, below is a listing and a summary of the records that I received, I reviewed, and I relied upon in the preparation of this report. And then here you list how much time was involved in the identification, in a compliance with 4062.3, which requires that we identify. How much time was involved in the listing and review and summary, as is required by 4628, and the listing as is required by 10606. You indicate your time right here in minutes and hours. Well, we then get into our review of records section of our report. And doctors, this section of your report should be a masterpiece. Many doctors complete this section in such a haphazard fashion with no format at all, and it looks terrible. And it represents the doctor in terrible fashion. But I'm telling you, this section of your report should be a masterpiece, because the parties are going to look at this section and see, okay, what is the information that this guy reviewed? What is the information that this gal relied upon? What is the information that this doctor received from the parties? Perhaps there's a document that's missing. If it's not listed and it's an important document, perhaps it's missing. In other words, the parties are going to look at this section and see where your opinions and conclusions are coming from. And this is the section wherein you detail listing and summarizing those pieces of information. So you begin this section by using a table, and the table should list the date of record in chronologic order. Now, doctors, I want to tell you, I can't tell you how many reports I've reviewed and critiqued for QME doctors that list the records not in chronologic order. And that makes absolutely no sense at all, and it looks so disorganized. And it looks terrible, in my opinion. The records should be organized in the date that they occurred chronologically. So, for example, this is January 1st, 2013. We have a record from Greenhouse MD. It is the primary treating physician's progress report. That's a PR2. And then you list, then you summarize the document. Now, doctors, what information do you want to include here in your summary? Is it necessary to retype and reiterate the entirety of the primary treating physician's progress report? No, it is not. But what's important here is that you summarize the information on the document that's important to you, that you are going to later use to rely upon for your opinions and conclusions. So I'm just making this up, but as an example, this could be, current complaints, or I think they call it subjective complaints. Whatever the doctor's commenting on, you might put it right here if it's important to you. Treatment plan, discharge from care without permanent impairment. No further treatment needed. Whatever's on the document that's important to you, that's going to contribute to your opinions and conclusion, goes here. So notice our compliance with the codes of regulation and the labor codes. Here we've identified the information. It's a primary treating physician's report from Greenhouse MD. We've identified it. We've reviewed it and summarized it. So we reviewed it, we read the document, we summarize it here in our own words with the information that's important to us. We listed the information. This is our list. This whole table is our list. And then finally, we listed it and summarized it. So here's our list and here's our summary. And we continue with our review of records in exact same fashion in chronologic order, listing the author, the name of the document or the type of the document, which might be, for example, a doctor's first report of occupational injury or illness. It might be an MRI report, cervical spine. It might be some results of electrodiagnostic studies. Whatever the document is, we list it here, and then we provide relevant details down below in a bulleted list that's clear, that's clearly outlined so that the reader can extract the important information from it quickly. Okay? Down here, include all of the documents that are generated as part of the QME evaluation, such as your own QME intake questionnaire. This would be filled out by Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones gave you a description of job injury, or job duties, I mean. These would all be authored by Mr. Jones. All of the symptom questionnaires that you use, those all get listed through here. And then, if you order diagnostic studies, the results of your diagnostic studies would go right down here. So this might be, for example, San Francisco Radiology Group. Report of findings of lumbar spine MRI. And then summarize the document. You don't have to reiterate the entirety of it. You're going to do that later on in your diagnostic studies section of your report. But here you would simply provide some relevant details that contribute to your opinion. Findings in a bulleted list. L5, S1, broad-based disc protrusion, ... whatever it is. Make sure all your fonts are consistent throughout. Same type of font, same size of font, using a bulleted list. Impressions. Whatever it is. Okay, doctors? So let me reiterate a couple of comments about the review of records. The review of records is one of the complexity factors under 9795 Code of Regulations. So because it's one of the complexity factors, if you're billing for the higher level of complexity, your review of records section of your report should demonstrate the complexity consistent with your billing level. Let me reiterate that. The review of records section should be consistent in complexity with the complexity that you're billing for under CCR 9795. So because this is one of the complexity factors, this section of your report should be a masterpiece. It should be a brilliant document. It should be in tabular format. It should be in date chronologic order. It should be a bulleted, formatted table. And basically, it should look perfect. It should have no typos. And this is where you will refer back to this section many times as you go through your report, because this helps you identify quickly without having to thumb through the entirety of the medical records. You can refer to this as an index of the medical records and the points that are important to you in the medical records, so that you don't have to yourself go through the entire stack of the medical records when you need to look up an important piece of information. So this section of your report should be a masterpiece. And it's not a section of your report that you simply gloss over or that you complete as an afterthought. This is one of the primary sections of the report, and that fact is governed by codes and regulations.
Okay, so doctors, I hope you get the idea on this. In today's discussion, we made it as far as the review of records. And in our next session, we're going to continue on through the various topic headings in our report. And I'm going to share with you many ideas as to how to install credibility and persuasive power into each of those sections of your report, with the end result in mind being to create high quality reports that can be used by the parties. So let's just summarize the ideas contained within today's session. And that is that it's one thing in the body of your report to comply with the codes and regulations and laws and rules and all the dictates governing the production of our QME report. It's one thing to comply with those. It's another thing entirely to demonstrate to the parties and pop the parties in the face with your compliance with all of those laws. So in the body of your report, you demonstrate attention to detail by, number one, quoting the specific regulation, quoting the specific labor code that governs the particular section in your report, first quoting it, and then demonstrating to the parties that you comply with that code, that you comply with that regulation, that you comply with the dictates of the case law governing that particular section of your report. And when you do this 1-2 punch, you quote the labor code, you quote the regulation, and then demonstrate your compliance with that code, with that regulation, you impress the parties with your attention to detail, and it instantaneously elevates your credibility in the body of your report and creates persuasive power when it comes time for you to provide your opinions and conclusions. In other words, it's your attention to detail that causes the reader of the report to believe in you and to believe in the correctness and the accuracy of your opinions and conclusions. So doctors, I encourage you to adopt as many of these ideas into the body of your very next report as you can, and as you do so, you will infinitely improve the credibility and the persuasive power and ultimately the usability of your report by the parties in the system who depend on us to provide work products that they can actually use. What a concept. Okay, so doctors, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion. I look forward to being with you on our next session as well, as we continue our new series entitled The QME Report, The Compliance, Credibility, and Persuasiveness Check Sheet. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter, wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.